Uh, Hello, everyone. So I'm Rob, and thank you very much for joining us and going through the updates to the FSE core labour requirements, the 40004 version, 4000423 version 2 and the 2011-16 version 2 advice notes that have been issued by FSC. So we'll be talking through the changes, the implications for certificate holders, the implications for certification bodies, and essentially what is needed or what the changes and are. We can't offer consultancy. We can lead you to publicly available information. I will be answering some questions at the end if I can. So if you have any questions as we go through the presentation, please put them in the chat box and I'll try to cover as many as I can as part of at the end. We can't answer all questions because there may be company specific ones which I won't be able to answer in this forum. I can't also answer any questions to do with costs or timescales involved when we get onto the subject of interface auditing high risk outsourcers. So we'll cover the background of why there's a change, what certificate holders are required to do, what constitutes a high or low risk outsourcer, any other high risk outsource mitigation, implications for high risk and outsource auditing by interface, and the timescales relating to the transition period for these two advice notes. This is a brief background. FSC issued the version 1 of the advice notes, and there was a lot of concerns relating to those and the implications to certificate holders and certification bodies. Essentially, it meant that all outsourcers in the UK and other countries, without evidence of a second or third party audit, were considered high risk. And that was because of the ITUC index, which had the UK as 4 at this point. So it meant that, everyone needed to be audited potentially, which added a considerable time to audits and would affect our ability as a certification body to audit all certificate holders. If you imagine there's thousands of probably outsourcers in the UK, even doing a square root, it added considerable time to each audit. It also added a cost to each audit. I'm not going to say that these new advice notes have eliminated any of that. It just means that there are other verifiable aspects that we can consider to ensure that if we are auditing, it is necessary, and we have more kind of freedom to evaluate other verifiable aspects. So first point is, what do certificate holders have to do in relation to the 40004 advice note 23? They have now separated the advice notes out. So 40004 23 relates just to certificate holders, and then the 2011-16 relates to certification bodies requirements. So 1.1 of this requirement is that certificate holders within their outsource agreements with uncertified outsourcers shall specify the commitment to core labour. We already require this. We have required this since the version 3 of the 40004 standard, version 3.1 of the 40004 standard came out. And the second point is that certificate holders shall include uncertified outsourcers within its self-assessment, and which describes how you as the certificate holder have confirmed the outsourcer's conformity with core labour requirements. And again, that is a requirement Interfaces has been implementing since the 40004 version 3.1 and the core labour requirements were launched and the transition period ended. So hopefully neither of those are particularly challenging or create huge changes for yourselves. If you've been audited by Interface, chances are you already cover those, or you've had non-conformities and have addressed them over the course of the last 2 years. A third point, which has been specified now, it relates to outsourcers and auditing by first, second, or third. So we as a certification body can determine a risk of the outsourcer if we are able to be provided by yourselves evidence of a first, second, or third party audit, including documentation and records, and evidence that it's been conducted annually, which is every calendar year, but within at least 15 months of the last audit, which has to, and again, they've specified this now, which has to include interviews by workers. So a document review or anything else isn't sufficient anymore. So looking at policies or processes that they have isn't sufficient on its own. It's also got to include that audit part. The interview part. First party audit would be an assessment by yourself using your own resources. So an internal audit, if you've got PFC certification, there's already an element of the core labour requirements in relation to that. So you'll already be part of that. Second party is an assessment that's performed by a person or certificate holder who has an interest in the object of the assessment. So that could be yourself or someone who you employ or hire as an independent contractor to do the audit. So that's first and second party audit. It could be yourself or someone who's independent of the outsourcer. And the third party would be ourselves outside of the FSC certification audit, so outside of your annual surveillance audits. And the objective is this, and the only way that we can deem them low risk if there are no findings relating to the conformance. So if you do an internal audit or a first, second, or third party audit on your outsourcer and evidence concludes that there is issues with their conformance to core labour, then that would not mean that we determine them to be low risk. It would mean that we potentially determine them to be high risk. Yes, we'll come back to this again because this kind of loops back around to what we do and how we assess risk. So we will come back round to this. It'll be touched on briefly in a minute as well. This is where we come in then. So as a certification body, we have to assess your control over the outsourcers and the conformance with the core labour requirements. And currently this is included within our outsource register. So within our outsource register, which has been provided to everyone, there is an element of risk of mixing, which is with the high risk indicators and also risk mitigation indicators. And then there's also the core labour risk assessment, which is further along. So this is currently what our risk assessment in relation to outsourcers looks like based on the version 1 of the 40.004.23 advice note. So complaints, any non-conformities, previous evaluation on site of the audit, include information including self-assessment and country of origin, this ITUC and CPI indexes, which were the issue that everyone was coming across in relation to high-risk outsourcers. So what would constitute a high-risk outsourcer? An outsourcer would be classed as high risk automatically if there are any substantiated concerns since our last audit of you. So if we've audited you and then between then and our next evaluation, there have been substantiated concerns regarding your outsourcer's conformance, that would then deem the outsourcer to be high risk. So we don't, in my experience and our experience, it's rare that there is a substantiated concern, especially in the UK. UK law is it's in line with the core labour requirements, and most people who are going through this are in conformance with the UK law and therefore core labour requirements. And the second part is that in the previous FSC evaluation, so our evaluation of the certificate holder, yourselves, it's resulted in non-conformity regarding the outsourcer's conformity with the core labour requirements. So this could be that you haven't included them within the self-assessment, or the evidence within the self-assessment isn't sufficient to ensure that you can put a certainty on their kind of conformance with core labour, or that you have an agreement in place which doesn't cover the commitment to core labour. So that would then mean they're automatically high risk or they are deemed to be high risk. So on the other side, there is also ways that they can be deemed low risk, so which is different to the previous risk assessment, which was, they've kind of done it in a different way this time, unfortunately. So essentially, it's low risk if we, as the certification body, or yourselves, through a first, second, or third party audit of the outsourcer, which has been conducted on site within the calendar year, within the year, has identified no issues in relation to their compliance with core labour. So if we've done an audit or you've done an audit, then we can deem, and there's no issues, then that is a low risk outsourcer, and we can consider that low risk when we come to do your evaluation and ensure that that we can take that into consideration when we're assessing the outsourcers. It's not just this second part, or isn't just that it needs to demonstrate conformity. It needs to be done at least annually, so we need to see evidence that it was done within the calendar year, and if you've done more than one, which in a few years there's potential for that case, that it was done within 15 months of the last one, and that the audit findings are made available to us so we can review them as the certification body to assess whether you have covered all the core labour requirements, whether there is sufficient evidence of conformance, whether there is evidence that you have assessed documentation, and also that you've interviewed workers in relation to the outsourcers' core labour. So as we do with yourselves, when we come and do an audit, we will interview staff members as well as your self-assessment, and your policies will interview staff members to assess whether they can identify or they are aware of any issues to do with core labour, and essentially is the same thing for the outsourcers. There are other verifiable aspects that we can consider as the certification body when it comes to high and low risk categorization of outsourcers. So if the last two slides, they're not automatically low risk through an auditing demonstrating conformance, then we can consider not just these four, but these are the four that FSC have referenced within their guidance document. And we can see whether this would then mitigate any risk and whether we can then assess the outsourcers as low risk. So firstly, FSC have deemed that the core labour, the FSC controlled wood national risk assessment should be used in the first instance. So, and specifically within that risk assessment, there is 2.2, which is in relation to labour rights. So FSC have conducted national risk assessments for quite a lot of countries, which assesses various aspects relating to controlled wood, but one of those is labour right indexes. So, and in this case, and in the UK's case, that has been deemed low risk by FSC. So there is strong evidence that then we could use this as mitigation for any potential high risk outsourcers. Second one is corruption perception index. So again, it needs to be over 50. The UK is 71 out of 100, so it would be deemed low risk. ITUC, which is the International Trade Union Confederation, this is where previously we'd failed on. So for the UK, it is high. To be deemed low risk, it needs to be 2 or less. So a score of 2 or 1 would be deemed low risk. Italy, for example, meets their requirements, so they're deemed low risk through this requirement. But in the moment, the UK is a 4. Therefore, under this factor, we would be deemed high risk. However, we need to take into consideration all elements of this. So we don't need to either use all 4 or just use these 4. We can take into consideration any combinations. And the final one, labour rights index, again, 70.5 or above is deemed low risk, and UK is 80, so we would be considered as high risk. We aren't just looking at the UK, obviously. Outsourcers are in a lot of different countries, so if we are going to consider this and look at a risk assessment based on other verifiable factors, there is considerations for all countries throughout Europe and Turkey where a lot of our certificate holders have outsourcers, and there may be outsourcers that are deemed low risk for the UK that may be deemed high risk for Ireland or the Netherlands or Germany, for example. So, but we will have a look at all countries to assess against mainly these requirements to see whether we can use any of the verifiable aspects to deem outsourcers low risk. And what we will do is we will update the core labour, the outsourcer register with the new requirements to mirror the new FSC requirements, so that when we complete that, we can use that as evidence that we've assessed the high and low risk categorization of outsourcers and any further action that's required. So if you have an outsourcer and they are low risk based on the above factors, what do we need to do as the certification body as part of our audit? What do you need to be able to provide to the certification party as part of your audit and as evidence of conformity with the requirements? And it really comes down to a document review of 1.1 and 1.2, which is the self-assessment, your indicators of how you are aware of how the outsourcer conforms, and the outsource agreement and the commitment to conformity with core labour requirements. And providing that they're sufficient, providing that we can review them and they meet the requirements, and there's no issues regarding existence of complaints or non-conformities or anything else, then that is as far as we need to go with the low risk outsourcer audit. For high risk, there is slightly more. So it would mean we would be evaluating the information the certificate holder has documented in your self-assessment and the agreements against the conformity of the outsourcers through the actual documentation and an on-site visit where interviews with personnel is done. So we, again, as we do with your current audit, we would interview staff members of the outsourcer and on-site observations. So we're looking, basically, we're not assessing the outsourcer of their conformance. We're assessing your control over the outsourcer for your conformance. It's your certification. You're responsible for conformance at your own organization for core labor, but also any outsourcers that you're using. So we're not yet. So if there's a finding, it may be a finding that your self-assessment that you've completed with how you are aware of the core labor, the outsourcer's conformance, may not be sufficient. Potentially, you've said that all outsourcers under our control have, or under our agreements, have contracts. Employees have contracts at all. We go, we interview a person. They say they don't have contract. Then that's a non-conformity, that the evidence that you've included to demonstrate that your outsourcers comply isn't sufficient or accurate. So whatever controls you've taken or whatever measures you've taken aren't an accurate representation of your outsourcer's conformance. The same way as we would with yourselves. So there isn't very much difference between the outsourcers and yourselves. If we look at your self-assessment and you say you've got contracts with every employee, we interview someone and they don't, then we'd be raising a non-conformity against your self-assessment for the inaccuracy of the information in it. Or it may be, so that could be a potential non-conformity. In the case of high risk, if you have 10 outsourcers, we don't need to go and audit all 10 high risk outsourcers. So we can use sampling methodology that we do for the multi-site standards, which is essentially a square root rounded up of the number of high risk outsourcers. So if you have 10 high risk outsourcers that have been identified, then we would need to visit 4 as part of your assessment. So it wouldn't mean that we have to audit them, but obviously it does add audit time. So as long as yourselves and we can demonstrate low risk, it does mean that we can limit audit time, we can limit on-site visits. It means we can review the evidence and ensure conformance across all requirements. The other thing with that is it's very, at the moment in the UK, we don't have a huge amount, but there is also the risk of mixing. If there are a combination of risk of mixing and a risk of core labor, then we can combine them. So maybe you have 5 high risk for the risk of mixing and 5 high risk for core labor. We can combine them together to create one sample, and then we'll just choose in relation. We won't pick all of them for high risk for mixing. We won't pick all of them for core labor. We'll take a selection of outsourcers to make sure we're auditing the requirements and the issues. For multi-sites and group certificates, there is another issue relating to this. So if you have a multi-site where you have multiple sites, multiple outsourcers, different outsourcers are used by different sites. If a site itself is using a high-risk outsourcer, then the site becomes also a high-risk site. We then need to sample high-risk sites separately to the normal sites. So again, if you have 10 you have 10 sites within the scope of your certificate, 5 of them are high risk, 5 of them are normal, then we would have to sample them separately. It doesn't necessarily mean that the audit sample would increase in all situations, but there is a potential that if you have high-risk outsourcers, that it would increase the sample size required as part of our annual surveillance audits and recertification audits, in which case, obviously, there's a potential for an increased cost if there's an additional day required. We would also sample the high-risk outsourcers per site. So if one site has 3, another site has 2, we'll do a square root of 3 for one site, we'll do a square root of 2 for the other site. So it's a little bit more complicated, but that's more for us to be concerned about and us to make sure that we're auditing you and the number of sites we need to audit against to make sure that your evaluation is sufficient. Timelines. Fortunately, with the changes to version 2, they have increased the timelines and the implementation and the transition dates. So the effective date of this advice note was the 1st of November 2024, and it ends, the transition date ends on the 30th of December 2025, so just over a year. During this period, certificate holders may choose to implement these requirements. They may choose to look at first, second, third party auditing. They may not. You may choose to not evaluate that at that point. But once the transition period ends, so as of 2026, providing there are no more changes or extensions, we and yourselves will be required to meet these requirements and audit against these requirements. We'll be looking at updating the outsourcer register through this transition period, and we'll add that to everyone's client portals once we have updated and we're aware of what we're going to do and we've looked at the other verifiable aspects. And we'll email everyone, as we've done with this, to ensure everyone's aware of any updates so that you can start to use the new outsourcer register to record your outsourcers, to submit to interface for approval and review for the risk. And then we can continue to maintain that as the evidence that you've informed us that we've done the risk assessment and that you've kind of got all the outsourcers where they need to be. We will start to, as we have done with the version 1s, we will start to audit these requirements throughout 2025. We want to be prepared. We want you to be prepared. So we will start reviewing. It is unlikely that we will go and visit any high-risk outsourcers during 2025. The chances are that, as we have done with the version 1, that we will look at the information you've got, look at whether you've considered this advice note and whether you've done any information or mitigation or you've done any evaluation of outsourcers, ensuring that you've got everything you need to do. But we will then potentially raise observations. So if you've done the audit but you're unable to provide it, then we'll go, okay, there's an observation, there is evidence that, or they've said they've done an internal audit, however, it wasn't available at the time, therefore observation, or they've done an internal audit or first party audit, but it wasn't on site, it didn't include staff interviews, observation. Because it's not a mandatory requirement until 2026, we want to give you the time and the preparation to kind of assess what you need to do and what we need to do to make sure that, yeah, like I say, everyone's in conformance with the requirements, and are aware of the requirements and can manage those requirements going into 2026. I will now take some questions, potentially if there are any. If there aren't any, that's great. Hopefully it was clear. Doesn't appear as if there are any questions. No? Okay. What I'll say then is thank you very much. I'm sorry it was quite a short webinar, but hopefully it covered everything that you need to know. It made it clearer. It was hopefully useful and informative. If you do have any questions in regards to these requirements that are more company specific, potentially, if you have any particular scenarios that you want to discuss or look at, then by all means send us an email. We can't do consultancy, but if I'm able to kind of look at it through publicly available information and discuss it with you, then I will do that as much as I physically can within our remit as a certification body. The webinar will be has been recorded and is recorded and will be available on your certificate holder portal, interface portal, following this. So if any other people you need to watch this, or if there's any information you want to go back and look at again, or if there's anything else that you want to look at as we go through the process, then we can. And like I say, thank you very much for joining us. And I'm sure I will talk to most of you at some point during this period and going forward. Thank you.